Hi, seventh graders. This is going to be your lesson, your first set of notes lesson for my class. It's going on ecology and energy transfer. If you haven't received a paper copy of these notes, then it is time for you to get one from the sub or from the teacher that is in the room. Again, the assignment at the top of the paper will actually say ecology and energy transfer. Okay, make sure you pick that up now. You will need a pen or a pencil in order to fill in the blanks for this lesson. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tell you what words to fill in the blanks. If you have a different set of notes, then you will be required to have a highlighter in your hand, and you will highlight the important words that I tell you to either fill in or highlight. So either way, in this activity, you're going to be doing something interactive as I'm going through the notes for this lesson. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to go over are what are the parts of an ecosystem. An ecosystem, which you should see right here in blue, oops, let me go back, is a community of living things in their non-living environments. So things that you should think of when it comes to examples of a living thing in the environment, okay? So in this case, I'm going to type in some answers here, okay? Examples of living things would be animals, plants, bacteria, Monera. People are like, what the heck are Monera? Monera are single-celled organisms. And my favorite, fungi. So these are all examples of living parts of an ecosystem, okay? Now, part of an ecosystem that is non-living. Okay, this is a little bit more difficult for people to realize, but without these items that we're about to write out here, then an ecosystem would not be an ecosystem. For instance, water. Water is an essential non-living part of an ecosystem. Okay, sunlight. Even in the darkest of caverns, there's going to be a little bit of sunlight. And even in the ocean, there's going to be sunlight. Okay, you'll have minerals. Okay, soil, rocks, okay, and then most importantly, gases. And most people, when they think of gases, they don't necessarily think of gases being the ocean, but you have things such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, ironically, that's also found, those are the same gases found in our air. Okay, you also include other gases such as nitrogen. And those are going to be essential gases that we're going to be talking about in the upcoming units, such as the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, and the oxygen cycle. All right, moving on to the next page, okay? What determines where a population can live in an ecosystem? Okay, a habitat is a place where an organism lives within an ecosystem. So an example here is the miles of grassland can be a habitat for a coyote. If you think about your habitat could be your house or your apartment or your motorhome, things like that. It's where you actually live in an ecosystem. It's much, much smaller than the actual ecosystem itself. The next thing that determines a population is something called a niche, not niche, it's a niche. A niche is the position or role a species has in an ecosystem. An example, a squirrel that eats seeds from trees and builds nests in the forest. So a squirrel's role is to eat the seeds from the trees and to build nests in those trees, which is in the forest. Without the squirrel, the seeds would actually be overpopulated. We might actually have too many trees. I wish that was actually a problem that we have, but it's not. So with that being said, the next thing you're going to do is you're actually going to watch the study jam called Food Chains, okay? I will actually put this link in Schoology for you to watch. So what you need to do right now is to pause me, go and watch the video called Study Jam Food Chains, then come back to this actual video so that you can continue with the rest of these notes. It is really important that you watch a study jam because later on next week you'll have a quiz that actually picks up some things from these study jams. All right, so pause me now and go ahead and find the link study jams in Progress Book. Hopefully you guys caught that when I said progress book. It should have been Schoology. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide. How do organisms get energy? So producers are also called an autotroph. When you guys take biology over at the high school, you're going to learn that word autotroph. Auto means self, troph means food. So these are organisms that make their own food, hence a producer. Producers use sunlight to make food in a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a word you should have learned before. There's only certain organisms on this planet that actually perform photosynthesis, and that would be plants, algae, and bacteria. We've discovered there are a few others, but these are the ones that you need to know of so far. Again, these are organisms that make their own food. Another way an organism can get energy is by becoming a decomposer. A decomposer is an organism that gets energy and nutrients by breaking down the remains of other organisms. There's not many decomposers. The most popular ones are bacteria and worms. That's why you will find a lot of bacteria and worms in compost piles, because they're actually breaking down the food and nutrients into, breaking down the food and rocks and everything down into nutrients that the soil can use. If you are a consumer like us, you, me, we use the energy and nutrients stored in other living organisms by eating them because we cannot make our own food. Now, that's not the same as like getting pizza rolls out of the fridge and or freezer and putting them in the microwave and making quote unquote your own food. What they mean by that is they literally, organisms that are consumers cannot actually produce food from just gases or water or sunlight. We actually have to eat other organisms in order to get energy. There are different types of consumers, and you might have heard these before, especially if you are somebody who likes dinosaurs, because dinosaurs have always been used quite frequently when it comes to these words. Herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. Carnivores are organisms that eat other animals. So somebody asked me before, is a anteater, is an anteater a carnivore? The answer is yes, an anteater is a carnivore. Most people don't realize that when it means, people always say, well, carnivore is an organism that eats meat. Well, that's the whole thing. It's organisms that eat other animals. They can be spiders, they can be fish, they could be eggs, they could be cows or turkeys or chickens. As long as it's eating another organism or other animal, then that person or that organism is considered a carnivore. An omnivore eats both plants and animals. The way I remember that is omnivore starts with an O, so does the word option. So we humans have options, hence that's why humans are omnivores. And finally, we have scavenger. A scavenger is an organism that feeds on dead organisms. So these are a little tricky in terms of figuring out whether an organism is a scavenger versus a carnivore. Scavengers are what I call the lazy carnivores. They're the organisms that don't like to hunt. They wait for other organisms to do the hunting and then leave behind the carcass and then feed on the leftover carcass. So you've got your vultures, your raccoons, sometimes squirrels, rats. These are all scavengers. In some cases, you could even have cats that are also scavengers as well. So how is energy transferred among organisms? So the reason why that this is important, it all has to do with the circle of life. Basically, we have to follow this law. It's called the law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. So according to this law of conservation of energy, energy from one organism is passed on to another organism. So in other words, when you watch the movie Lion King and he talks about the circle of life, well, what he's talking about is basically when one organism dies or is hunted, that organism is eaten by another organism and takes on that energy from the dead organism. Eventually, when that organism dies, the energy from that organism is then passed onto the ground, and then the ground will then pass on its energy into the plant that grows from the ground, hence the circle of life. Well, we represent these circles of life in something called a food chain, and a food chain is the path of energy transfer from producers to consumers. So according to here, we've got a food chain. We've got the way you're supposed to read this is the energy from the sun goes into the plant. Notice the arrow here, okay? That arrow represents the direction that the energy is going into. So from the sun into the plant, from the plant into the bug, from the bug into the chicken, and eventually from the chicken into the boy. So look at the question on the far left. It says, which organism is considered the top predator? Well, according to this, the top predator would be the boy. The boy is the organism that actually gets the energy at the very end. In other words, without the bug, the chicken would not exist, and without the chicken, the boy would not necessarily exist. It would be a broken food chain. So, with that being said, this actually leads into how do we represent the levels of available energy in ecosystem? Well, we call that an energy pyramid. Okay, it's a model that shows the amount of available energy transferred from one organism to the next. So remember in our last slide, we had talked about which organism actually would be considered the top predator. And we said human. Well, in an energy pyramid, you would put your top uh, predators, your top consumers at the very top here on this energy pyramid. But take a look at how much energy that organism gets. It only gets 0.01%. So it actually doesn't get a lot of energy. So therefore, organisms that live toward the top have to eat more food than the organisms that are like toward the bottom. So like your primary consumers, they literally get 10% of the energy that a producer makes. Producer, because it makes its own food, it gets all 100%. Well then, if the primary consumer eats the producer, it gets 10%. The secondary eats the primary, it gets 1%. The third level eats the secondary, only gets 0.1%, and then it becomes us, where we get 0.01% when we eat any of these organisms below us. We don't get the full amount. So that's one of the big problems with being the top predator. Next, you're going to look at food webs, and this is pretty close to being the end of this lesson. Well, a food web, as definition shows here, it shows the feeding relationship among different organisms in an ecosystem. Food webs are made up of many food chains. So if you look at this, you're actually going to take the food chain and kind of mesh them all together. So for instance, okay, you're going to, if you're looking at the spider right here, I know it's a little confusing to see. The spider actually eats the grasshopper, okay, but the shrew eats the spider. So does the weasel, also eats the spider, and then according to this, the hawk also eats the spider. So this is actually how you can represent one organism that is eaten by others, or that organism eats many different choices of organisms. Another great example, the weasel can eat grasshoppers. It also has a choice of eating the spiders or even the shrews. So again, you can do that with food webs. So pause me for a second and go into Schoology and watch the video called Study Jam Food Web. You're going to want to do that for as part of this assignment, okay? So go ahead and pause me and watch the Study Jam video in Schoology. All right, if you came back after watching the study jam in Schoology, you should be able to answer this question. Which organism or organisms does the bird eat? Okay, so here's the bird, not the owl, the bird. So which organism or organisms does the bird eat? So take a look at this and see if you can answer the question. So the answer to the question is actually going to be, if you don't know yet, hit pause and go back and look at it. Press play when you're ready. So the organism that the bird eats is actually two of them. They're the grasshoppers and the grains. Look at the next question. Which organism or organisms eat the bird? So now we're doing the opposite. So we want to know what's going to take on the bird's energy when it dies or gets eaten. So pause here, take a look at the the food web and then replay when you're ready to answer the question. So the organism that eats the bird, there's only one, and that would be the fox. Okay, foxes are the only one that eats the bird. Notice how there's only one arrow coming out of the bird into the fox. Okay, so with that being said, make sure you have filled out your worksheet. Okay, these are your first set of notes for this unit. When you are finished, you're going to want to keep this in your folders. If you missed any of the words throughout this video, then you can go ahead and replay and play back. Make sure you have completed the study jams on food chains and food webs as part of this assignment. All right. Any questions? Send me a message.